Hello learners, we are now going to study a literary form called the sonnet. A study of the sonnet form will help us understand the concept of form in poetry, its importance to the overall impact of a poem, and how it helps in communicating the poem's message. You may also be encouraged to examine form in other poems. Besides gaining some insights into the long history of the sonnet, you will also learn to appreciate rhyme schemes and formal structures. We'll first take a look at the origin and history of the sonnet form. Before Shakespeare's day, the word sonnet meant simply little song, and the name could be applied to any short lyric poem. The term comes from the Italian sonetto, which is derived from suono, meaning sound, and was derived from the Latin sonus. The Italian poetry of the 16th century is said to have been originally an imitation mainly of the poetry of Provence in southern France. There, in the 12th century, under a delightful climate and in a region of enchanting beauty, had arisen a luxurious civilization whose poets, many of them men born of noble birth, had carried to the furthest extreme the woman worship of medieval chivalry and had enshrined it in lyrical poetry of superb and varied sweetness and beauty. From Provence, Italy had taken up the style, and among other forms for its expressions, in the 12th and 13th centuries, had devised the poem of a single 14-line stanza, which we call the sonnet. The sonnet is said to have been created by Lentini, head of the Sicilian school under Emperor Frederick II. Other Italian poets of the time wrote sonnets, but the sonnet was brought to a high form of development in the 14th century by Petrarch, Italian poet and humanist. Petrarch is best remembered now for his sonnets dedicated to an idealized lady named Laura, whom he glimpsed in a church and with whom he is said to have fallen in love at first sight. Described as being ideally virtuous as well as beautiful, Laura was permanently unavailable. The use that Petrarch made of the conventions of courtly love for a beautiful, unattainable lady became known as Petrarchan conventions. Some of that love is excruciatingly painful. The angelically beautiful and virtuous lady is cruel in rejecting the poet's love. And love is a religion, the practice of which ennobles the lover. Christian and classical imagery coexist. The poet is subject to extremes of feeling and internal conflict. Love is short, but art lives long. The poetry will outlive the poet. The sonnet was introduced to England by Sir Thomas Wyatt in the mid-16th century. The sonnet form, like the love theme, became very popular among the English lyric poets of the next two generations. It is the only artificial form of foreign origin which has ever really been adopted and naturalized in English. It still remains the best instrument for the terse expression of a single poetic thought. Imitating Petrarch, Wyatt nearly limited himself as regards substance to the treatment of artificial love theme. He generally departed from the Petrarchan rhyme scheme by substituting a third quatrain for the first 4 lines of the sestet. That is, while Petrarch's rhyme scheme and rhyme arrangement is either ABBA, ABBA, CDC, DCD, or ABBA, ABBA, CDE, CDE, Wyatt's is usually ABBA, ABBA, CDD, CEE. Wyatt's work was continued by poetical disciple and successor Henry Howard, who held the courtesy title of Earl of Surrey. He improved on the versification of Wyatt's sonnets, securing fluency and smoothness. Though his poems are less numerous than those of Wyatt, his range of subjects is somewhat broader, including some appreciative treatment of external nature. He seems, however, somewhat less sincere than his teacher. In his sonnets, he abandoned the form followed by Wyatt and adopted, still from the Italian, the one which was subsequently used by Shakespeare, consisting of 3 independent quatrains, followed, as in the case of Wyatt, by a couplet. The couplet sums up the thought with epigrammatic force. Thus, AB, AB, CD, CD, EF, EF, G, G. Wyatt and Surrey set fashion at court. For some years, it seems to have been an almost necessary accomplishment for every young noble to write love poems based on Italian and French models, for France too had taken up the fashion. In Elizabethan England, the sonnet became a fixed poetic form, consisting of 14 lines, usually iambic pentameter in English. Sir Philip Sidney and Edmund Spenser both produced important sonnet sequences in the late 16th century. The most well-known sonnets are those of Shakespeare, who wrote 154 sonnets. Since its introduction into English in the 16th century, the sonnet form has remained relatively stable, proving itself a flexible container for all kinds of poetry, long enough that its images and symbols carry detail rather than becoming cryptic or abstract, and short enough to require a distillation of poetic thought. For more extended poetic treatment of a single theme, some poets have written sonnet cycles, a series of sonnets on related concerns often addressed to a single person, and sonnet crowns, a sonnet series linked by repeating the last line of one sonnet in the first line of the next, until the circle is closed by using the first line of the first sonnet as the last line of the last sonnet. Different types of sonnets evolved with variations in rhyme scheme and metrical pattern, but most sonnets have a 2-part thematic structure containing a problem and solution, or a question and answer, or a proposition and reinterpretation within their 14 lines. A sonnet usually expresses a single complete thought, idea, or sentiment. Most sonnets also have a volta or a turn between the 2 parts where the poem takes a new direction or changes its argument in some way. This change can be subtle or really obvious. There are three different forms of sonnets: Petrarchan or Italian, English or Shakespearean, and Miltonic. Let's now examine a few important sonnet forms. We'll first take a look at the Italian sonnet. A sonnet is fundamentally a dialectical construct which allows the poet to examine the nature and ramifications of two usually contrastive ideas, emotions, states of mind, beliefs, actions, events, or images by juxtaposing the two against each other and possibly resolving or just revealing the tensions created and operative between the two. Basically, a sonnet shows two related but different things to the reader in order to communicate something about them. Each of the major types of sonnets accomplishes this in a somewhat different way. There are, of course, other types of sonnets, but we'll discuss just the basic types with a brief look at some non-standard sonnets. The Italian sonnet is divided into two sections by two different groups of rhyming sounds. The first 8 lines is called the octave and rhymes ABBA, ABBA. The remaining 6 lines is called the sestet and can have either 2 or 3 rhyming sounds arranged in a variety of different ways. It could be CDC, DCD, or it could be CDD, CDC, or it could be CDE, CDE, or so on. The exact pattern of sestet rhymes, unlike the octave pattern, is flexible. In strict practice, the one thing that is to be avoided in the sestet is ending with a couplet, as this was never permitted in Italy, and Petrarch himself, supposedly, never used a couplet ending. In actual practice, sestets are sometimes ended with couplets. For example, Sidney's Sonnet 71 is one such, ending with a couplet as in an Italian sonnet. In strict practice, the one thing that is to be avoided in the sestet is an ending with a couplet, as this was never permitted in Italy, and Petrarch himself, supposedly, never used a couplet ending. In actual practice, sestets are sometimes ended with couplets. One such example is Sidney's Sonnet 71. The point here is that the poem is divided into two sections by the two differing rhyme groups, in accordance with the principle, which supposedly applies to all rhymed poetry but often doesn't. A change from one rhyme group to another signifies a change in the subject matter. This change occurs at the beginning of line 9 in the Italian sonnet and is called the volta or turn. The turn is an essential element of the sonnet. It is at the volta that the second idea is introduced, as in the sonnet London 1802 by Wordsworth. Here, the octave develops the idea of the decline and corruption of the English race, while the sestet contrasts that loss with the qualities Milton possessed, which the race now desperately needs. A very skillful poet can manipulate the placement of the volta for dramatic effect, although this is difficult to do well. An extreme example is a sonnet by Sir Philip Sidney, which delays the volta all the way to the 14th line. Here, in giving 13 lines to arguing why reason makes it clear to him that following virtue is a course he should take, he seems to be heavily biased in virtue's favor. But the volta powerfully undercuts the arguments of reason in favor of virtue by revealing that desire isn't amenable to reason. There are a number of variations which evolved over time to make it easier to write Italian sonnets in English. Most common is a change in the octave rhyming pattern from ABBA ABBA to ABBA ACCA, eliminating the need for two groups of 4 rhymes, something not easy to come up with in English, which is a rhyme-poor language. Wordsworth uses that pattern in the sonnet title, Scorn Not the Sonnet, along with a terminal couplet. Let's now discuss a few more sonnet forms, the Spenserian, the Shakespearean, and the Miltonic. The Spenserian sonnet, thus named after Edmund Spenser, as an outgrowth of the stanza pattern he used in The Faerie Queene, has the pattern AB AB, BC BC, CD CD, E E. Here the AB AB pattern sets up distinct 4-line groups, each of which develops a specific idea. However, the overlapping A, B, C, and D rhymes form the first 12 lines into a single unit with a separated final couplet. The 3 quatrains then develop 3 distinct but closely related ideas with a different idea or commentary in the couplet. Interestingly, Spenser begins line 9 of his sonnets, or most of them, with but or yet, indicating a volta exactly where it would occur in the Italian sonnet, as in the 9th line of Sonnet 54. Yet she, beholding me with constant eye. However, if one looks closely, one often finds that the turn here really isn't one at all, that the actual turn occurs where the rhyme pattern changes with the couplet. What then can move her, if not mirth nor moon? She's no woman, but a senseless stone. This gives the sonnet a 12 and 2-line pattern, very different from the Italian 8 and 6-line pattern. The Shakespearean sonnet is the English sonnet. Shakespeare's sonnets are written predominantly in a meter called iambic pentameter, in which each sonnet line consists of 10 syllables. The syllables are divided into 5 pairs called iambs or iambic feet. An iamb is a metrical unit made up of 1 unstressed syllable followed by 1 stressed syllable. The English sonnet has the simplest and most flexible pattern of all sonnets, consisting of 3 quatrains of alternating rhyme and a couplet, AB AB, CD CD, EF EF, G G. As in the Spenserian, each quatrain develops a specific idea, but one closely related to the ideas in the other quatrains. Not only is the English sonnet the easiest in terms of its rhyme scheme, calling only for pairs of rhyming words rather than groups of 4, but it is most flexible in terms of the placement of the volta. Shakespeare often places the volta or the turn at line 9, as in the Italian sonnet. Equally, Shakespeare can delay the volta to the final couplet, as in Sonnet 73, where each quatrain develops a metaphor describing the aging of the speaker, while the couplet then states the consequence. You better love me now, because soon I won't be here. This thou perceivest, which makes thy love more strong, to love that well which thou must leave ere long. The Miltonic sonnet dealt not only with love, as the 16th century sonnet did, but also politics, religion, and personal matters. The Miltonic sonnet has the same arrangement in the octave as the Petrarchan sonnet does, but no division is marked between the octave and the sestet, the sense running from the 8th into the 9th lines. On his blindness is a fine example. The rhyme scheme of the sonnet is ABBA, ABBA, CDE, CDE. The meter of the poem is classic iambic pentameter, that is 5 feet, with each foot having an unaccented syllable followed by an accented syllable. Some of the lines do not fit the pattern exactly, but the pattern itself is clear. In the 17th century, the sonnet was adapted to other purposes, with John Donne and George Herbert writing religious sonnets and John Milton using the sonnet as a general meditative poem. Both the Shakespearean and Petrarchan rhyme schemes were popular throughout this period. There were also many variants. After Milton, there was a decline in the sonnet's popularity in England. English sonnets came to a low point in the 18th century when Samuel Johnson defined a sonnet as a small poem and a sonneteer as a small poet in contempt. The Romantic poets revived it in the 19th century. The fashion for the sonnet went out with the Restoration, and hardly any sonnets were written between 1670 and Wordsworth's time. However, sonnets came back strongly with the French Revolution. Wordsworth himself wrote hundreds of sonnets, of which some of the best known are Upon Westminster Bridge, The World is Too Much with Us, and London 1802, which is addressed to Milton. His sonnets were essentially modeled on Milton's. Keats and Shelley also wrote many sonnets. Keats's sonnets used formal and rhetorical patterns inspired partly by Shakespeare, and Shelley innovated radically, creating his own rhyme scheme for the sonnet Ozymandias. Its rhyming pattern is unique. However, there is a volta in line 9, exactly as in an Italian sonnet, and on the pedestal these words appear. Sonnets were written throughout the 19th century, but apart from Elizabeth Barrett Browning's Sonnets from the Portuguese and the sonnets of D.G. Rossetti, there were few very successful traditional sonnets. In Canada, during the last decades of the century, the Confederation poets, especially Archibald Lampman, were known for their sonnets, which were mainly on pastoral themes. Gerald Manley Hopkins wrote several popular sonnets, often in sprung rhythm, and also several sonnet variants. By the end of the 19th century, the sonnet had been adapted into a general purpose form of great flexibility. It is interesting to note that the popularity of the sonnet form is continuing today. The sonnet has a fixed form that is paradoxically enormously flexible. The sonnet adapted well to 20th century themes and diction. With the advent of free verse, the sonnet was seen as somewhat old-fashioned and fell out of use for a time among some schools of poets. However, a number of modern poets continued to use the form. Among the major poets of the early modernist period, Robert Frost, Edna St. Vincent Millay, E. Cummings, all used the sonnet regularly. Yeats wrote the major sonnet Leda and the Swan, which used half rhymes. Wilfred Owen's sonnet Anthem for Doomed Youth was another sonnet of the early 20th century. W.H. Auden wrote 2 sonnet sequences and several other sonnets throughout his career, and widened the range of rhyme schemes used considerably. Auden also wrote one of the first unrhymed sonnets in English, The Secret Agent in 1928. Robert Lowell wrote 5 books of unrhymed American sonnets, including his Pulitzer Prize-winning volume, The Dolphin, published in 1973. Half-rhymed, unrhymed, and even unmetrical sonnets have been very popular since 1950. Perhaps the best works in this form are Seamus Heaney's Glanmore Sonnets and Clearances, both of which use half rhymes, and Geoffrey Hill's mid-period sequence, An Apology for the Revival of Christian Architecture in England. The 1990s saw something of a formalist revival, and several traditional sonnets have been written during that period. There are, of course, some sonnets that don't fit any clear, recognizable pattern, but still certainly function as sonnets. The new formalism movement in the United States has contributed to contemporary interest in the sonnet. The word sonnet, which is concise and visual in effect, is an interesting experiment with 14 lines having one word per line. Frequently allusive and imagistic, they can also be irreverent and playful. The sonnet can be a lens through which to look at poetry over the last 4 centuries. Many scholars agree with Gertrude White, who says that the qualities of a good sonnet are found not in its conformity to some external pattern, but in its unity of design, condensation of thought, exactitude of language and image, and even at its most meditative and abstract, its essentially dramatic nature. C.F. Johnson, in Forms of English Poetry, asserts that the beauty of the sonnet depends on the symmetry and asymmetry both, for the parts are unequal in length and different in form and melody. In this, it resembles things of organic beauty as opposed to things of geometric beauty. It involves the principle of balanced yet dissimilar masses, of formality and freedom, like a tree which has developed under the rigorous law of its growth, and yet is shaped by the chance of wind and sunshine into something individual. The sonnet form could not have endured the test of time for so many years if it had not embodied some of the underlying principles of beauty. Perhaps the best thing about the sonnet is that you do not need much time to read one. Hope you will read lots of lovely sonnets and begin to appreciate poetry better. Thank you.